really good to be here. And just before I start talking about energy and renewables and everything, I think I just want to like give a bit of like respect to the group that this issue around how to adapt to climate change is such a challenging one, and it's like really amazing that like Thursday night getting onto Zoom and like with other community-minded people to think about how can you actually approach that. We need to have more people trying to do this because we're all going to be facing these kinds of issues over the years. But it's like by coming together as a group that you build the community resilience and you learn to work on these things over time. So yeah, just I think that what you guys are doing is really awesome. Little bit about me. Yeah, I'm originally from New South Wales. I grew up on the south coast there. I grew up in an off-grid property. So my parents were privileged enough to be able to have solar and batteries back in the 90s. And we had a really awesome time growing up in the bush. In many ways, it was quite a simple upbringing. Like there were definitely modern mod cons, as you'd call them, things that we didn't have. And I think, when I was a child, like I kind of thought like, oh, there's all these things we don't have. We don't have a microwave, or we don't, we did actually even like running hot water was a problem for us. But growing up in such a special place and also being able to have that connection with nature and to live simply was actually a great privilege that I've learned later in life. And I think it's also something that kind of continues to inspire me today. Um, but yeah, the last few years I've been coordinating the Yes to Renewables campaign at Friends of the Earth, and our role is a bit more focused on how do we accelerate the shift to renewable energy. So as we shut down the coal-fired power stations, as we stop the fracking, like Gary mentioned, we need to build the new, and what does that look like? A lot of that work is more focused on the large scale side of things, but it's also very important that we're holding up the community owned aspect of the energy system, and both at the consumer level, like individual households, but community owned projects, publicly owned renewable energy projects. That is a really significant part of this issue. So I haven't really like prepped a speech or a presentation as such, so I kind of will just ad lib a bit tonight. But to start, I think that like it's important to recognize that at the moment we might have energy security if you're connected to the grid. You can switch on the lights, you can access all the benefits of electricity. But we don't necessarily have energy resilience, and that's partly because the actual energy we're using is driving climate change. So that's inherently not resilient. We're facing this whole problem because of fossil fuels. But we also have problems in the system around inequality in the cities, and in many places that might be around who can access, who can afford to pay for electricity, who can afford new solutions like solar or batteries or electrified homes. And as I said at the start, if you're a renter or if you're receiving welfare, like all of those things are much more difficult to access compared to if you're someone that has capital, if you have a home, etc. We do have we are doing very well in some ways in Australia. Per capita, we have the highest installation of solar in the world, which is, a great sign of like how we can be a leader, but we've got inequality in how people access that. I probably will focus a bit more on like regional areas tonight, more so than metro. But yeah, I think in the metro areas, it's that inequality issue and the affordability issue that has come with the privatized energy system that I think is a really big part of what does it mean to be energy resilient in a city. But yeah, as we change the energy system, it is becoming, or it will need to become more resilient, particularly with the impact of climate change, the worsening impacts of climate change. So, like what we have at the moment, it's a centralized system. In Victoria, obviously, we have the coal-fired power stations in the Latrobe Valley, that's, pumping electricity along high voltage transmission lines to the load centers, which are mostly in Melbourne and, in some key areas of industrial activity, like in Portland. Uh, it's a it's a highly privatized system. It's a national electricity market, and electricity is traded as a commodity. But what we're moving towards is a more distributed system, where instead of just having the centralized power producer that sends electricity from here to there, you have a multitude, a plethora, like a kind of, it's a bit more like a garden in a sense, where you have many different types of energy sources, many different ways of even transporting power, and that will need to become a resilient system. There's an inherent advantage to that because you're not necessarily reliant on um, a single generator like we are at the moment. But we will have more options. So, in this situation where maybe one wind farm has a problem, that won't necessarily disrupt the entire system. So there's inherent advantages to that. But as we go along, energy resilience, it really kind of hits the rubber hits the road. Like some people spoke about this in the start, like when you're at the end of the line, you don't necessarily have access to good quality electricity. So that is something that we need to address, but we can address now with new solutions. So communities that are maybe at the end of the grid that have frequently been dealing with blackouts or brownouts, because of the just inherent weakness of the distribution network there. They now have the chance to develop community microgrids, rooftop solar and battery systems where energy is shared amongst that community, and they can be energy resilient and energy independent in many ways. There are some specific problems that we have in the state around these types of regions and the distribution network in particular. So what we have, if you think of power lines, there's the transmission lines, which are the very large high voltage towers that transport power from the big generators. And then that then gets fed through the distribution network to households. So there's a couple of different parts of the system. And in many parts of country Victoria, we have these things called, it's a bit of a weird term, they're called swirl lines. I think it's single wire earth return. So this is really nerdy stuff, but basically this form of distribution line is not, a lot of them are, it's very old. They can't handle large amounts of electricity, and previous inquiries into the Black Saturday fires found that this was one of the key fire risks. So just from the aging infrastructure and the problems of distribution lines catching on fire and then potentially turning into a bushfire. So, as we deal with climate change and the impacts of that, our actual infrastructure can introduce risks, but we have the opportunity to upgrade that. So in some parts of the state where, you might have a farming business, so they might actually have pretty poor energy resilience because their power is coming from one of these like aging swirl lines. And when it comes to action on climate change, they might actually be a pretty big user because they're like, if you've got a farming business, it could be a dairy. There's quite a lot of energy that's getting used. You could theoretically change that all to solar batteries, but the aging infrastructure can't actually handle the amount of new electricity. So if we're looking for ways to help people cut their emissions in ways that will actually help, then continue to have their livelihoods, we could look at incentivizing people that are operating these types of businesses to have access to solar and batteries, but also to upgrade the infrastructure, upgrade these old distribution lines. So this could actually unlock a lot of new renewable energy generation that is like appropriately scaled for people. That's not necessarily the super large scale stuff, which we do need in some places, but we don't necessarily need everywhere. So we think there's an opportunity here, particularly for the state government, to and the network companies to upgrade these lines and then to basically help unlock what people call the missing middle of renewable energy generation. You know, it's not just rooftop solar on your individual home. It's maybe like a larger commercial or community energy project, but a lot of the times that is dependent upon upgrading distribution networks as well. So I think that's a really interesting example that could actually lead to a lot of solutions and solutions that are owned by communities where they can have control over that. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was how how people respond to disasters. So like I said before, I'm from New South Wales, and we grew up in this bush property. And so during the most recent summer of bushfire disasters, my parents didn't live at this property anymore. They live more in town near the beach, but we still had access. We still had the property and still had like a number of dwellings there, small cabin and stuff like that. But that property was massively impacted by the fires that came through, which was really horrible to experience. Even if you're not immediately there, just knowing the place that you're really connected to is impacted and so damaged by the fires. And when that was happening, we were at the coast, and my mum, she was traveling to Nowra for work, which is about an hour away, and she actually got separated from while she was driving home. They just cordoned off the roads because they were doing backburns, and um it was a really scary moment because we just really didn't know what was going to happen. And the cell phone towers were down. She was running out of battery. There were other family members that, yeah, they were in sections of town where the the power systems and the sewage systems had been impacted because of loss of power. And that was, basically because of distribution lines like being impacted by the fire. And I guess the reason that it was all okay in the end, my mum made it home, and it was just a scary moment in this moment of disaster that we were reunited. But those kinds of experiences, and anyone who's been in like a severe weather will know, it's like you need to try and access power and also telecommunications so you can be in contact with the people that you love. And so, I think there's a question here around like, how do we make sure that communities can stay resilient in these moments? How do we make sure that people can have access to these essentials? So that, yeah, you can stay in touch and you can care for each other. So after that summer, there was some people in the group Voices of the Valley that did some thinking about this, and they came up, which is based in the Latrobe Valley. They come up with this concept of smart refuge centers. And so what they were basically trying to set out is that, like, we actually have in towns, in our communities, we have places that people go, but at the moment those community spaces are not necessarily resilient because they're also dependent just upon the grid. And so if you're able to identify, some of you would, if you think about your town, there might be like, oh, that's the library, that's where we go when there's something happens. But if that place isn't resilient to shocks, like that can also face problems. So we need to be able to identify these places and then make sure that they're set up with the solution. So, rooftop solar, battery systems, so we're not relying on diesel generators, so that people can actually have that that sort of safe refuge, and that is actually also still part of the solution to climate change. So it was a really nifty way of bringing it all together. I can share, they got like a little brief where they describe it. I'll put the PDF in the chat. And that we made that part of our budget submission at Friends of the Earth, and so part of our advocacy to state government. And they did actually end up funding a program that was very similar. And I'll just share the link. So I think the government ended up calling them I don't think they used the term resilience hubs, but they created the Energy Resilience Solutions Program, which is a $7.5 million program. It's not a lot of money in the scheme of things for state government. And that basically funded the rollout of solar and battery systems to community buildings in a number of key communities, the Dandenongs, parts of East Gippsland, places that have been affected by windstorms, etc. And that's not necessarily going to fix everything, but this is the kind of thing that we need to do more of. And a lot of this is about what can communities do and how can we work together, but we absolutely need to also get support from government so that we're not just doing this alone. So I think this is a really good example of how we can bring climate adaptation and climate mitigation together in a way that's genuinely going to improve people's lives, whether that's what you need to do to deal with disasters or in preventing disasters and how our energy system is designed. So just wanted to highlight those examples. There's probably a bunch of other examples we could talk about, and happy to share more resources in the chat, but I might just leave it there, and then if we want to keep talking, we can. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pat. Are you happy and have time to answer a couple of questions? If there are any burning questions that anyone has? Yeah, put your hands up. Philippa, is that a hand up from you? Go for it.
No, I was just thinking as you talked, Pat, then should, we get on to lobbying about the upgrades, because we've heard it mentioned so many times in articles, but, we're all held up because the infrastructure's no good and things like this. So, if we could sort of focus on something, it can be a lot easier than trying to just have so many issues to sort of lobby on. And whether that would be to our state government or would it be to federal, or I'm thinking with our group, our climate action group, we're sort of thinking, should we become more political? And these are some ways that we could, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's really important to be political. Like, we have to do the community work and we're together, but like there are entities that have a lot more resources that can help. And yeah, I guess it's like, this is where groups like Friends of the Earth and others come in. We work together, we combine our power, and we're more powerful when we act together. So whether it's this particular idea or some other thing, I'm sure we can find ways to make that happen.
Yeah. And I'm just wanted to clarify, is it the state, that manages the grids, or is it federal? I'm never.
Yeah, so electricity is a state government responsibility.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a constitutional difference. So yeah, the state is the one that's responsible for keeping the lights on. The federal government still funds programs, and they have the checkbook, so to speak. So there is still definitely a role for the federal government, but it's mostly in providing money. And the stuff that we're talking about, the federal government's unlikely to get down into that level, whereas the state government and local governments, are more likely to be a bit more engaged. So it kind of depends like what we're seeking.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Tony, go for it.
Sorry. Look, mine was more a comment from what you were saying. There's the East Gippsland Climate Action Network that we're part of. There's a subgroup that's doing a climate ready communities program. which is trying to address some of what you're talking about, trying to get people to prepare for disasters. There's been a lot of work done after the bushfires, but this is more every disaster, not bushfires. And there's a few strategies we're using. We tried, one was trying to do an art group that tried to bring about conversations. The other was a traditional meet over a cup of tea and have a conversation. Probably the most successful one has been a game that's been developed. It's like a board game, and you throw a dice, and it prompts cards being picked up in conversations, and really it's just an excuse for conversation about preparing for particular scenarios. And there's a pilot being done in Meetung, which is trying to get together a plan for that community. It's very hard to get people along, but they've had groups of a dozen or more coming together and working through some of the issues that they need to be a prepared community. Anyway, just thought that was a comment.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like an amazing case study, and like the kind of thing where it's like it deserves resources and support from governments, I think, to get more of this kind of thing happening in more places.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tony. Yeah, a really great model and where you've been working over there in Gippsland, and it's definitely something that other groups can be inspired by. So yeah, great work. Anyone else have any questions for Pat?
I have just a couple of quick questions, Pat. Just one, what's happening on the renewable energy hubs that for renewables, Friends Earth was working on through Protect the West? Pat Nisbet and our group been talking about these hubs, and we were sort of thinking maybe mobile hubs, where they can go around from place to place. Have you got time to talk about that a little bit? And also, Pat, what's happening was mentioned, I think, last year about the big battery set up at near Alcoa or Port and Smelter. Is that still progressing or not?
Yeah, cool. Maybe I'll start with the hubs, and I have to apologize for language, because this word hubs, people love the idea of a hub, and therefore the term gets used in many different ways. So I think I spoke about these smart resilience centers and energy hubs before about, getting the batteries and solar onto those buildings for communities to be resilient. So that's like, sometimes people imagine that's the hub. But this campaign that we've been part of, the local energy hubs, this is a bit more around community education and because one of the issues we've identified, there's so many different renewable energy projects are being proposed around the country. Like there's dozens, if not hundreds, and it can be really confusing for communities, and like that there's often information vacuums in regional areas around these projects, and with that vacuum, that's where misinformation spreads. And so the concept of local energy hubs is really around what's the information and knowledge and support that communities need as their whole regions are going through these transitions, particularly for regions where there's a lot of renewable energy being built. But these things could come together. So I've just put a link to the website for that campaign. There's a really good campaign video on there that explains the concept. And yeah, we've been working alongside the Community Power Agency and Realliance to push the federal government to support that. Because, they talk about social license as an issue and the challenge of getting social license for a lot of these large scale projects, but the government actually needs to put real effort into that and not talk about it. So we have been campaigning and advocating for that. I'd say we've gotten close, like the federal government is interested, and they know that they need to do something about how to bring communities along with this large scale shift to renewables. But I fear that we haven't quite got over the line. So it's like It feels really close, but we're not quite there. So that's a bit of an update there. I don't know a lot about that specific battery project, and yeah, there are lots of different projects around the place. And yeah, I guess Alcoa, because it's such a big energy user, there's also the Kentbrook wind farm nearby, the offshore wind farm, a few other projects. So I can't really update on that specific one, but I'm happy to yeah, just maybe ask someone in a I'm actually going on long service leave, so I will be off deck for a few months, but we can probably look into it a bit and let you know, Gary.
Thank you, Pat.
Cheers.
Yeah, Kathy, you got your hand up?
Thanks, Vicky, and thanks, Pat. So I guess one of the questions I have is that I've done a little bit of reading around the microgrids, and that there have been a number of communities out in regional Victoria, and then also regional and remote Australia, that have set up their own microgrids. But when it comes to actually establishing that, it becomes quite more technical than most people's knowledge is. And so that one of the results of that has been to rely on the local or on the power provider that from the central power providing company. That's at least my reading of it. And so I'm curious to hear from you about whether you know if there's any ways that people might be able to get support if they were setting up a microgrid in the technical area.
Yeah, and I think, this is one of the things that why we were campaigning for that local funding for that local energy hubs program is because people want these things. They want to learn how to do them and they want to be able to control it. And that's amazing that there's that level of excitement. Like, how many issues are there out there that people are like, we want this? But yeah, there's not enough support. So we think that like if the hubs model, which is like a network of 50 hubs around the country, that would part of the remit would be supporting communities to do this kind of thing. Previously, the state government, they had a program called Community Power Hubs. And part of what that did was they funded local groups to do like business cases for their own energy projects. So some groups would have looked at microgrids, but that program ended. It wasn't that expensive, but it does require money. So yeah, I think we just need to see a lot more support for communities so they can get their own solutions developed. The example that I think is maybe kind of what you're talking about. So the group might be familiar with Totally Renewable Yakandanda. They're kind of like a bit of a shining light of how to do this stuff. So, they started with their sort of their community bulk buy of solar panels, installing that on people's homes, using the savings from that to reinvest into new projects so to get more solar on more people's homes. It created this revolving fund, which has then allowed them to step up their ambition over time and what they can actually do as a community. But even that group, which is like highly, lots of social capital, lots of highly skilled people, I think they are doing a microgrid, but they are partnering with I think AusNet to deliver that. So at some point there does the bar's pretty high, and these projects cost a fair bit of money. And there's a lot of like regulatory barriers to getting them up, even if you are just a fully private entity. So yeah, there are some barriers to having a solution like that is fully community owned. So it probably is going to be a bit more of a patchwork of like communities working with like the grid companies or like a private developer, or maybe even like a publicly owned, maybe in the future it'll be with the State Electricity Commission, which I think would be better overall, but it's still early days. Yeah. So I wish I could point to an example where a whole community did a whole microgrid itself, but I'm sorry, I'm not aware of it.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Pat. It is quite tricky, but the unfortunate downside to it, from my own little bit of research, is that can communities end up having to pay the retail price still of electricity at least some of the time? Is that your understanding?
I mean, I feel like maybe my knowledge is not strong enough in that area because it does get really technical. But yeah, like I think that it really depends on your perspective. Like some people might actually look at microgrids and say, well, other energy users are subsidizing these sets of users, and maybe that's actually good for those people that are in it, but maybe not so good for the other electricity users. So there's a lot of different debates around the pros and cons. But yeah, it would partly depend on how are you fully disconnected from the grid. I think most people would still be connected to the grid, but if you're relying on if you're using more solar, and you're not transferring electricity from further away, I imagine your electricity bills would be significantly cheaper in this sort of microgrid scenario. Yeah.
You saw the hand.
Yeah, just flagging that it's 7. Are you up for one more question, Pat, before you go?
Sure.
Yeah, last question. Go for it, Tony.
I'm being bad. I'm doing another comment. I think just going on what Kathy was saying, there's one of the things I read about recently is the option is being explored of being able to sell your power to neighbours and to people who don't have solar panels and things like that. I just thought as a comment that was an interesting thing that maybe it brings about some equity. And I've heard the same things about some of the microgrids being controlled by the power companies, and that is not that appealing.
Yeah, I think there have been some examples where, because it is this like innovative edge of like, what does the new system even look like? And so people are trying to figure out how to do it. And some of the examples of that where like it might be set up by AGL or something. So they might say, oh, you're on the microgrid program, you're sharing your electricity, but actually like they're able to game that system. So I think, yeah, we need to be aware of those power dynamics, and hopefully communities can enter into good faith sort of agreements if they are working with companies. And the Yakandana example is probably one of the better examples of that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Pat. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your time with us this evening.